front line it's relatively porous. It's not really clear where the front line is because Ukrainian infantry will often hold positions, but in many cases they're told by their commanders to not engage Russian infantry unless they have to, or unless they close very close to their positions. In many cases, they tell their infantry, allow Russian infantry to walk behind you. So the nature of the fighting is quite different, and I think it would surprise people in that degree.
While the world's attention has been focused on Donald Trump's peace summits in Alaska and Washington in recent weeks, the battles along the front line, specifically in Ukraine's east, have raged as intensely as ever. To really understand what's going on the battlefield at the moment, we sat down with Rob Lee, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and one of the top experts on this war. We've actually just come back from a research trip together to Ukraine's east, speaking to some top commanders of brigades and battalions, and now we're going to speak 6 months after we last talked in this office. I remember last time we spoke here in the office, it was the end of February, and people were looking at Oval Office, geopolitical events, but the front line was actually stabilizing at the time, coming into the end of winter. Now it's the end of summer. Where are we now? Is it better or worse than what you expected, and what's the overall situation?
So if I remember what we talked about in February, we knew that the summer was going to be tough in the winter, and that for different reasons, weather is, I think, more favorable for offensive operations. We know Russia prefers using dismounted infantry assaults. It's easier as an infantry to move forward when you've got more the tree lines are back, when there's vegetation, when the weather's warmer, and also Russia can drop more glide bombs as the weather affects the sortie rate. So we knew for a number of reasons that the situation would become more difficult this summer than it was over the winter. And you can see that the monthly kind of rate of advance Russia's achieved this summer is, it's greater than it was over the winter. The fast rate of advance that Russia had on a month-by-month basis was last November. They've not yet reached that level, but they are advancing faster than we were last summer. I would say thus far, the summer has not turned out as badly as it could have. I think for the most part, Ukrainian lines are holding. There's obviously a kind of serious moment that happened a week ago in Dobropillia area, but ultimately the big kind of question is still Russia can continue tactical advances. That's something we've been seeing for a year and a half. But the question is whether or not they'll be able to achieve an operational breakthrough, whether or not there'll be a collapse of lines, anything along those lines. And we haven't seen that thus far. And it's far from clear that they will be able to achieve that. And we're at the end of summer, and so we're coming up into the fall. I suspect we're going to continue seeing Russia try to advance as much as it can before the winter. But if they get to the winter, then the rate of advance will probably decrease again. And I think at this point, Ukraine is probably going to prevent Russia from taking all of Donetsk Oblast, which I think is the main priority right now.
You mentioned the Russian push near the city of Dobropillia in Donetsk Oblast, which I think from time of recording happened a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. I want to ask, it was quite concerning at the time. We were looking at the map, we were looking at the deep state update kind of piercing through much further than we'd seen before in a daily update on the map for a long time. It seems to have now come under control from what we know from the ground. What was the factor that really let that happen in the first place? What trends led to that? And could that happen elsewhere on the front line now?
It's similar to what Russia's doing elsewhere on the front line, where we see infiltration tactics across the front line, and that is a response to kind of a lack of manpower on Ukraine's side. But to the extent to which Russia can kind of exploit that and achieving kind of real success is variable. And in this case, it looked as though it was kind of a deeper push. They had more success than normal. It was quite concerning because the direction is quite concerning because, if they can continue advancing that direction, you put both Dobropillia and Kyiv at risk, and potentially kind of Donetsk Oblast kind of long term. And so it was quite a kind of big concern. But when we talk about infiltration tactics, it makes it more difficult to really understand and assess, what is the control on both sides, right? What is the front line? It's not necessarily clear the Ukrainian infantry hold the front line. If it's very small groups, and Russia can get behind them. And then when Russian units are infiltrating past the front line, which is constant essentially, they obviously don't always control what they're operating. So that's always kind of difficult. I think it's become much more difficult to map this war in general, but it's also difficult to kind of, I think, demonstrate that, because really the front line, it's not always a kind of coherent front line. It's more just gray zone where Russians might be operating, multiple kilometers in one direction. So I think in this case, what happened was, we know the Russians, they like to look for weak spots on the line. They go after particular brigades they think are weaker, or battalions within brigades they think are weaker. They'll look to attack whenever there's a seam between two units, areas of responsibility, which can often lead to coordination issues. I think in this case, they found a unit that was one of the weaker units on that part of the front line. The terrain, I think, was more to conducive this because there are a number of kind of north-south facing tree lines, some ravines they could use for concealment as they move forward. I don't necessarily know that there was anything particularly notable about this operation. I think that basically the Russian infiltrating groups just had success, and they kept moving and moving further and further, and they weren't stopped. And so I think the limit of the furthest they got, as far as I know, is the village of Petrivka, which was right past the road between Dobropillia and Kramatorsk. And I think that's something like maybe 18 kilometers past the front line of what it was at the time. But it wasn't just infiltration; it was an advance too. And so my understanding is that about 250 to 300 Russian soldiers made it into that kind of salient. In this case, Ukraine was able to stabilize it because they reinforced the area with, they changed they moved the Azov Corps over. They redeployed a number of units that were able to stabilize the situation. Obviously, 93rd Mechanized Brigade and I think a number of air assault units and likely a number of battalions from different brigades as well. So they're able to stabilize the situation. I think they're going to be able to pull back the northern part of that salient, and they'll be able to pull back. But ultimately, it demonstrates this weakness that there still exists. I think one of the other contributing factors is that the Ukrainian brigade that was there might not have passed enough information fast enough to kind of say this is what's happening. Maybe they didn't know the full extent of it, but that also creates problems because one thing that adjacent units often face is that if there's infiltration through one brigade's area, they'll often go into the rear of the next brigade who will not know about it. And then it could be their Mavic teams or EW or SIGINT, even artillery positions that get threatened. And in case of Dobropillia, I think there were artillery positions that had to fight back some of the Russian infiltrators. Ukraine was able to stabilize the situation. But my view is that in most cases, infiltration tactics will likely only lead to kind of tactical advances on the Russian side. But if the Ukrainian units that are there don't kind of acknowledge what's happening, don't necessarily immediately kind of respond to it, they don't have the capabilities of kind of quickly clearing those areas, then it creates a risk that it could lead to a greater breach or even a breakthrough.
Before we continue with this conversation, I just want to remind you that everything we do here at the Kyiv Independent is made possible not by billionaire owners or sponsors, but by you, the readers and the viewers. To help us continue to do what we do day in, day out, please consider contributing to our reporting by becoming a member of the community. Click the link below to learn more. Just want to ask, I think, briefly about the dynamic between control and chaos of a situation, because it seems to be like a kind of dichotomy that comes up more and more. Of course, the official Ukrainian military always says it's tough, but it's under control. But in reality, when we hear about these Russian infiltration tactics, Ukrainian commanders themselves mention that it creates chaos because they come into our rear, as you said, they start assaulting Mavic teams, EW teams, artillery teams. What does that mean for the cohesiveness of and effectiveness of a brigade as a whole, and how can that potentially lead to breakdown on an operational level?
Well, we haven't seen it yet, right? So again, I think one thing that it's important to keep in mind is you'll often hear lots of problems about coordination issues, about these infiltration tactics, about the issues they create. But ultimately, the question is, okay, so what? What does this lead to? And thus far, it hasn't led to. We haven't seen Ukrainian lines break, right? We haven't seen units kind of mutiny. We haven't seen those things. And in many cases, for infiltration, the best way to kind of counter it, because look, we know that Ukraine doesn't have infantry, so they can't just block Russian infantry everywhere. But in reality, it's if the front line does not kind of panic. If the frontline infantry, they know there are Russians behind them, but they don't panic, they hold their positions. That's kind of one of the key aspects. So in Pokrovsk, obviously a number of Russian soldiers made it past the brigades holding the front line into the city, but the brigades didn't fall back, right? The infantry didn't fall back, they held their positions, and it meant that it didn't lead to a kind of real breakthrough, it didn't lead to a real breakdown. I think also when we're talking about infiltration, it's both sides trying to make the other side's position kind of untenable, right? So you try and cut off logistics. We know at this point, Ukraine infantry, almost 100% probably resupplied by UAVs or UGVs at this point, by 951 UAVs or UGVs. And so if you have Russian infantry who get beyond them, they can maybe cut off those positions, right? Maybe they start shooting down UAVs, maybe they bring up EW, maybe they make it impossible for UGVs to come up. And so that could make the position untenable for Ukrainian infantry. But at the same time, for the Russians, it's the same is true. So yes, Russians can get behind you, but some brigades have developed kind of very good techniques for countering this, where even if infiltration occurs, as long as you kind of stay calm and you can still support your infantry and you can counter, make it impossible for the Russian infiltrators to kind of sustain themselves, then, it won't lead necessarily to a breakthrough or any kind of significant advance. And so I think we're in a different stage of the war where the tactics have changed. And, one of the brigade kind of S2s that I talked to, he compared it to kind of a boxer's clinch, that, they're kind of in this struggle. And you're kind of jockeying for position. It's chaotic, right? So the front line is not always very clear what it is. It gets even more chaotic in some villages where you might have units that are essentially cut off, but you can resupply by UAV. And so I think the demand on infantry is really tremendous, and I think that's one of the big things to keep in mind is the burden of this war is it's very narrowly focused on a small number of Ukrainians. I mean, obviously it affects all Ukrainians. All Ukrainians are holding up against Russia, but the infantry in particular are really shouldering a massive burden. And for them, in many cases, they might be in position for, you said, 3 months, 4 months, in some cases, more than 200 days. And it's nothing short of heroic what those guys are doing. But again, that's what's really enabling or preventing Russia from achieving more is you have people who are staying there. And in many cases, as long as you resupply them, we're seeing is that a lot of guys who are mobilized soldiers, guys who are older, they're kind of showing how incredibly tough they can be. And it's quite impressive to see. And, I think one thing when we look back at 2024, the manpower problem was there for Ukraine, right? And it was quite concerning when I was here in June 2024 because there were some brigades that were very undermanned, but ultimately it didn't lead to a breakthrough. It didn't lead to a collapse. It didn't lead to any of these kind of things. And, it's still a question of today. We know manpower situation is still a problem for Ukraine. I don't think things have gotten better. I think there's a concern that Russia has closed the gap in terms of use of UAVs because units are getting better, and that advantage Ukraine has somewhat kind of narrowed. But it's still a question of, so what? What is this going to lead to? And is it going to lead to anything more than tactical advances? And that part is still not clear.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the manpower crisis because that's nothing new. Like even back in late 2023, early 2024, we heard commanders say that this is the biggest problem, not enough people. But it seems like a quite broad and vague topic. Like what does that actually mean for the way the Ukrainian military and maybe on a smaller level, a brigade or a battalion actually fights on the ground?
I think by necessity, they have to rely on UAVs. And so that's become a development, and it's an important development, but it's also, it's a way of compensating for lack of infantry. I think if Ukraine had enough infantry, they would be, probably fighting a different way. And ultimately, I don't think Russia would be advancing if they had enough infantry. That is the main kind of factor that enables Russia to advance. But it's not sufficient for Russia to achieve breakthroughs thus far. That's kind of what we've seen. The AWOL rate is still a problem, right? That's still an issue. It's clear that Russia right now is still able to recruit enough soldiers, whether through just monetary and financial incentives, or I think Horst said that maybe a quarter of the soldiers who have been recruited so far this year are coming from either prison or they're being kind of coerced with criminal charges to join the military. But ultimately, Russia has a significant advantage. That is the kind of defining characteristic of what's happening. I think we talk about the situation on the front line. It's often compared to World War I, this war, and I think that's a kind of not very good analogy in that it evokes the kind of idea you have these big trenches, we have a lot of infantry, and that's not really what the front line looks like. The front line isn't, it's relatively porous. It's not really clear where the front line is because Ukrainian infantry will often hold positions, but in many cases they're told by their commanders to not engage Russian infantry unless they have to, or unless they close very close to their positions, because once Russia can identify a Ukrainian defensive position, they can launch just successive waves of FPVs, of Molnias, of artillery strikes, and they can destroy frontline positions. And so Ukraine is kind of adapted where instead they rely on UAVs to kill Russian infantry. In many cases, they tell their infantry, allow Russian infantry to walk behind you. We will rely on our UAV teams to stop them, just hold the frontline positions. So the nature of the fighting is quite different, and I think it would surprise people in that degree. There often isn't necessarily a very strong second line either, and that's why infiltration tactics, I think why Russia's adapting that way, because if you get behind the front line, they can make it untenable for Ukrainian infantry if they can prevent logistics getting to the front line. And if there was maybe a second line, that would make it more difficult for Russian infiltration groups to kind of gather or maybe be stopped. But I think it really depends on the terrain, depends on the part of the front line. Some brigades are obviously better manned than others, so it kind of affects how they fight. But the manpower aspect is really the critical factor, I think, explaining the nature of the fight right now.
So yeah, just talking about infantry, I mean, you mentioned the front line being porous, and these bigger and bigger holes. Often infantry being told that they need to stay in their positions, in their holes, rather than come out and fight. And we have heard like crazier and crazier numbers about the record number of days infantrymen have stayed on position, and less and less positions per kilometer, less and less infantry. Where could this possibly go in the future?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the debate different commanders have. And so I think in Ukrainian brigades on the front line, you often, maybe 10% of the soldiers in the brigade are in the infantry. So it's actually a relatively small percentage. Some of the brigades want to move even further, to maybe 20, to 1 to 20, ratio of kind of tail to tooth. And they very much want to kind of reduce the burden on infantry as much as they can, and as much as possible to try to create these kind of kill zones where you can rely on UAVs, artillery, what have you, to prevent Russian assaults. So, I mean, we're still moving that direction, but it's really hard to exactly say, how much infantry does Ukraine need? How vulnerable does it make Ukraine going forward? And can Russia ever kind of capitalize on this? Because, again, Russia is using infiltration tactics. That can be effective for tactical advances, but we haven't seen anything kind of more successful than that yet. And it's also a big question of whether or not, if Russia can't mass armor together, can they actually achieve a kind of operationally significant breakthrough? The last time we really saw a real breakthrough was in Kursk, and Ukraine used armor back then. And that was in large part because Russia wasn't expecting it, and they didn't have a kind of coherent defense with UAV teams, FPV teams, the things we see elsewhere on the front line.
So speaking of the Russian tactics, we've heard about Russians using small dismounted groups. I mean, in a way, ever since Bakhmut, when Wagner Group was attacking, but now they've seemed to really refine that with a specific focus on infantry. What, apart from hitting these weak points, what is the end goal? Again, they're not breaking through, they're not taking huge parts of territory all at once. So what are they really trying to achieve? And is that sustainable for them as well with the losses that they're taking?
I think that's a big question of this wars, right? What is sustainable for both sides? And I think we often focus on the challenges for both sides, and it's hard to say relative what is more significant. And I'd say, I talked to different people on the front line. Some of them think that Russia can sustain this, and that this is a really big threat going into next year. And other people see, weaknesses. They see that Russia, maybe the fact that we're seeing smaller scale assaults, maybe as an indication they don't have as much manpower as they want, or that they increasingly going forward, they might have to do another mobilization, and that maybe Putin wants to resist this. So that's it's difficult to say, I'd say.
One thing we have heard more and more, one name you could say from commanders all across the front line is Rubicon. And of course, Ukraine has always been famous for their innovation and their unique drone units. We see the videos all over social media. But now we're seeing more and more videos from the Russian side, which are looking pretty scary. A lot of fiber optic, a lot of really sophisticated strikes. Can you tell maybe the viewers what we know so far about what this group is, how it works, and what the effect is on the battlefield?
So the center was set up a year ago, last August, and it is set up under the Ministry of Defense of Russia. It's part of their new unmanned systems forces, which is something that Russia kind of, I think, developed based on Ukraine's experience. It's very well funded. It's a significant priority for the Russian military, and that means they're very selective about who they can recruit. They're typically recruiting younger people, more motivated people. They're very well funded. It's kind of the hub for all integration of procurement, of analytics, and of development R&D for all unmanned systems force, all unmanned equipment for the Russian military. So UAVs, naval drones, ground drones. They're supposed to be the hub in kind of centralizing that effort of procuring and developing new TTPs and R&D for it. They also have at least 6 combat attachments, and those attachments are one is subordinate to each group of forces in Russia. And they also have a reserve combat detachment that's kind of for the joint forces area responsibility. They likely have newer kind of units that have been developed since then. I think they put out a video for their anniversary a few weeks ago that said they had, I think, 12 combat detachments. That might be true. The 7 that are known, I think the rough size is about 150 personnel, maybe a little less than that. They are used across the front line, but often will deploy somewhere for maybe 5 days, 7 days at a time. They have different teams that specialize in different things. So they have a counter kind of ISR UAV teams that go in and have had quite a success downing Ukraine reconnaissance UAVs. They also have kind of counter night bomber UAV teams. They have Molnia teams. They have FPV teams. Their main focus is at greater depths. And so in the Pokrovsk direction, the second Russian, second combined arms army created their own kind of line of drones concept where they basically, they structured all their strike drone units in that area where they had some of the units were kind of given responsibility from the front line, 5 kilometers past the front line. Some were 5 to 10 kilometers past the front line. And Rubicon had everything beyond 10. But their confirmed strikes Rubicon zone with FPVs 35 kilometers past the front line. They get kind of the best equipment, so FPVs, other kind of new UAVs that are developing that have kind of artificial intelligence. In general, they'll often appear on the front line for maybe 5 or 7 days at a time, and then move to a different part of the front line, often right before an assault. And so it's kind of a way of maybe setting conditions for successful assaults. As you said, pretty much everyone we talked to, you mentioned this, all the kind of units on the front line have mentioned it as a problem. When 3 of the combat attachments were on Kursk, and so they played a kind of key role in Russia taking back Kursk in February and March. After that occurred, those attachments deployed to Donetsk and immediately became a problem. So they had some in the kind of Touretsk area, some in the Pokrovsk direction, other parts of the front line, immediately created new problems for the Ukrainian units there, often because they can reinforce the front line. And so, maybe a brigade is facing, Ukrainian brigades may be facing 2 or 3 Russian brigades. And then if Rubicon comes in, then you have also Russia will have an advantage, quantitative advantage in FPV teams and ISR teams and other things. And they also bring a kind of qualitative advantage compared to other Russian units. They play a big role in training. So they set training schools all across the front line. Some of the commanders we talked to would say that kind of they can tell after a few weeks of this training that the units there are much more capable in their operations. Russia's set up within its own regiments and brigades, its own air defense units now are conducting the kind of counter ISR mission itself with FPVs. So another kind of way they copied Ukraine. But the main focus is really isolating units. So it's isolating brigades, going after logistics, far past the front line, more than 10 kilometers past the front line. They also focus on going after UAV teams. So 2 of the brigades I spoke to, within like 1 week of Rubicon detachment arriving, one of them lost 40% of their UAV positions. Another one lost 70% of the UAV positions. And it doesn't mean that everyone was killed or wounded. It meant the positions were destroyed. And because we know that UAVs are responsible for maybe 80-90% of Russian casualties by Ukrainian units, that can be a quite significant effect. If those units kind of can't operate as effectively as normal, then that could potentially set the conditions for a more successful advance. So it's a quite successful unit. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to really thought this is a kind of new qualitative development. They're clearly scaling their efforts. They're very well funded, and so it is a kind of quite significant, I think, problem for the rest of this war.
I think going forward, a lot of commanders have identified the counter UAV team fight as a key one in terms of who can gain the upper hand over the next months or year of fighting. What does that actually look like? Drone teams hunting other drone teams on the battlefield, and can you identify who seems to have the upper hand at the moment?
It probably depends on the part of the front line. So I think part of the problem is when Rubicon deploys to an area, they might have a qualitative advantage over the Ukrainian brigade there, right? They're facing infantry battalions, UAV platoon, or that brigade because they're better funded, they're better trained, and they focus on very narrow task. I think that's one of the things that leads them to be successful. Is that instead of trying to do a variety of things, they just go in, we're going to say, we're just going to focus on UAV teams, logistics. We know elsewhere, I think Ukraine obviously has very, very good strike drone units. We know the drone line, brigade and regiments, unmanned forces obviously has very capable units too. So I think it's hard to say if there's one that has an advantage than others. I think that Ukrainian commanders, different parts of the front line will kind of give you different opinions of what the situation is. But I think one of the problems is that it's also a quantitative issue. So, Ukrainian brigade, according to table organization equipment, has more UAV teams than a Russian unit. So if it's one Ukrainian brigade facing one Russian brigade, they'll have an advantage in number of UAV teams. Obviously, it depends because the UAV battalions are not fully manned. But Russia often has maybe 2 or 3 or 4 regiments or brigades facing a Ukrainian brigade. And so that means that they often have a quantitative advantage in FPV teams and other teams. It could be maybe 3 to 1, it could be more than that. And so those can create problems too. But in terms of the UAV versus UAV fight, I agree. This is, it's hard to say it will be decisive, but it could be. And for Russia, if it can actually properly kind of exploit its manpower advantage, I think this is what's going to be required is basically be able to degrade, suppress, defeat Ukrainian UAV teams in a kind of narrow part of the front, right? That could be a theory of success for Russia, but how they could achieve a breakthrough, it hasn't happened yet, but it is a kind of concern. I think a lot of the kind of techniques are things that we can kind of expect. When a UAV goes up in the air, you can follow it back to its launching point. So for night bomber UAVs, for ISR UAVs, in many other cases, one thing that Rubicon does and Russian UAV units are doing, we know that's become much more difficult to employ ISR UAVs past the front line, like Orlan Supercom. Ukraine had that development last year, which is one of the big kind of developments of this war, is using FPVs to defeat them and other kind of UAV interceptors. Obviously, Russia's copied that, but now Russia also uses FPVs in a kind of reconnaissance role, and so there's on the front line in the Покровsk direction, right? It's open fields, it's tree lines and villages. Well, all the important real estate is tree lines because you got concealment there. And so Russia can send out FPVs, maybe with a small charge, no charge, and just fly over every tree line looking for artillery, looking for EW, looking for UAV teams. And that can pose quite a big challenge because it's very difficult to stop that. Fiber optic FPVs are also good for reconnaissance because they can't be jammed either. And the spools are getting larger and larger, so that can be another option. So I'd say it's hard to say who has the upper hand. In many cases, it's localized, right? If it could be Rubicon reinforces one part of the front line and gets that kind of localized superiority, and then it could be Ukraine kind of responding, deploying some of its more of the UAVs there to kind of reinforce. So it's hard to say, but it's very clear a priority for both sides, and it's partially a quality issue, but it's partially a quantity issue. It's just having enough teams, and of course, the attrition of UAV teams is I don't know this for a fact, it's probably going up, right? Just because it is a priority for both sides to go after UAV teams, and it's becoming kind of more and more difficult to operate without that kind of targeting from the other side.
When we spoke last time, Trump was just arriving in the Oval Office, and we both agreed, I think, that the war would continue. It doesn't make sense, for there to be peace as long as Russia's moving forward. Can you just give us an idea of where we are at that point? What has Ukraine still got left? And with the current flow of the battle, what would it really take to take all of it?
I think it's hard to say, and it's hard to make the prediction. So I know some people have kind of come out and said, this is the Russian rate of advance. This is how long it would take at this pace to take all of Donetsk Oblast, which is, will take a long time. The risk is that, wars aren't necessarily linear. If you achieve a breakthrough, you might take back a lot of territory very quickly, like we saw in the Kharkiv and Kherson offensive that Ukraine achieved. And it's a question of, really, can Russia achieve a kind of operational breakthrough? That's not clear. That part is still a big question. It is also a question for me is, can you achieve an operational breakthrough if you can't use armor, right? Can you achieve this just with infantry assaults, with infantry infiltration? Is that enough? It's really hard to say. I think part of Russia's theory of victory might be that, Ukraine, that manpower becomes too big of a problem, that there's the collapse of lines or units don't fight. We haven't seen that, right? So, it's really hard to say how long it will take. I think that, it's unlikely that Russia would take Kramatorsk-Slavyansk this year, right? I don't think that's likely at all. Obviously, the battle for Покровsk has been going on for over a year, right? They got close to Покровsk, more than a year ago at this point. Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, right? These battles went on for a year, and they have not really significantly advanced, past that since then. Obviously, in the kind of Kharkiv area, Volkanovka, they advanced much faster last year. It's really hard to say, partially because Russia's going to advance wherever Ukrainian lines are weakest. And so it kind of comes down to, well, wherever Ukraine prioritizes defense, then Ukraine will likely hold it, and then Russia will advance in a different direction. So it's hard to say. Ukraine is obviously still holding Покровsk. They're fighting for encirclement, but they appear to be handling that okay for the time being. But yeah, when we go into the war into 2026 or longer, it's a question of sustainability. And that gets very difficult. And I think trying to predict anything more than 6 months in advance of this war it's very, very difficult to do. But, like we said in our conversation last February, the question really is getting up to this next winter, because it will likely be a slowdown in Russian rate of advance. Offensive operations will become more difficult. Is this the opportunity for negotiations? Maybe Putin, actually goes through negotiations. There's been a lot of, you said, flurry of meetings and other things in the press about what the U.S. is going to do. I kind of don't pay too much attention to it, because ultimately the main factors haven't changed, right? Which is that Putin's minimum kind of demands this war is take all the Donbass. He hasn't achieved that. And Ukraine is not going to give up Donetsk. I think, I don't think that's kind of politically palatable. I don't think militarily it's something they would do. And so that we have this kind of, impasse essentially. And that no matter what the U.S. wants, that's an impasse that, the way it gets resolved is that basically Russia either fails or they achieve to do this. And thus far, Russia has not achieved it. They are advancing slowly. I kind of think the war will probably continue as long as Russia is still advancing to that goal and they haven't achieved the minimum goal. But if at some point, Vladimir Putin becomes a view that it's not likely we're going to be able to take Donetsk by force, next year, and that you have growing economic issues, growing manpower problems, maybe his calculus changes, right? And of course, we're seeing greater success with Ukrainian deep strikes. So, that also could kind of change his calculus too. But again, things change very often in this war. Kind of hard to say, too much in advance. So I think we're going to, the war will keep going into winter. Maybe negotiations there's better prospects at that point.
Thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. For us here in Kyiv, it sometimes seems that in recent times, coverage of Russia's war against Ukraine has gotten increasingly vague and distant as foreign outlets make less and less visits to the front line and spend less time in Kyiv at all. Here at the Kyiv Independent, we're trying to do the opposite, getting you closer and closer to the front line in our field reports while speaking to top commanders and experts to really get the inside understanding of what's going on today's battlefield. If you like what we do and want to become a part of it, please consider supporting our reporting by becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community, following the link below. Thank you.